Well, Mike Finkel, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So you wrote an interesting book. It's sort of a hybrid of looking at the life of a hermit named Chris Knight. And we're going to talk about him, but also exploring the ideas of solitude and being alone. And is that important to being a human, being an individual? So let's talk about what drew you to the story of Chris Knight. So this is a guy who lived in the Maine woods, middle of the Maine woods, by himself for 27 years. How'd you get connected with this story, and why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, so I've been a journalist for like 27 years. This is only my second book. I got 3 little kids. I have a short attention span. If a story doesn't deserve to be a book length telling, then I'm going to avoid it. It's my tendency. I'm an impatient person. And boy, this story of Christopher Knight, the Maine hermit, really just grabbed me by every sense possible. You know, as you mentioned before, here's a guy who lived completely alone in the woods of Maine, which is really, really cold, by the way, for 27 years, and claimed he not only didn't speak with anyone, didn't see the internet, didn't make a phone call, never spoke a word aloud except for one syllable. Once he said hi to a passing hiker, never even lit a fire, which boggles the imagination, for fear that smoke might give his position away. Also, he became this, over the 27 years, he also became this very odd legend for food and clothing and a few survival things and books. He broke into these small cabins. I'm sure we'll talk about this further. He broke into these sort of summer cabins, simple summer cabins in the woods on the lake country of central Maine. And so there was this sort of legend built up about him, and people had wildly different opinions of him. Some people thought that this guy breaking into houses was like the worst thing that ever happened to them. You know, this guy broke into, if you break into someone's house, you can get 10 years in prison, even if you don't take anything. And other people thought this mysterious person might have some heroic qualities. And I love the fact that there was a myth, there was a person, and then, of course, the great question is, how did he survive? Why? And then what happens after a person who has been away for so long is thrown back into our very loud, very, 24/7, 365 society? What happens then? How could you not be interested? It's catnip for a journalist is what I'm trying to say.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So let's talk about Chris Knight's backstory. What year did he go off into the woods by himself? How old was he when he decided to do this?
Christopher Knight grew up in central Maine in a kind of an unusual family. He had 4 older brothers, 1 younger sister. They were a very private family. All the children, the Knight children, got extremely good grades in school. But more than that, the family did not have a lot of money, but they learned how to hunt and fish. They learned how to fix everything from electrical to automotive to plumbing. Their house, according to people that have been inside, it was like a library. They all read everything from Shakespeare to poetry. In the evening, they studied theoretical physics and hydrodynamics. And this guy's built this crazy greenhouse where they could, grow food all winter and not pay a dime to the electric company. Now, Chris Knight, people I spoke to that went to high school with him considered him shy. Some people said nerdy, but no one expected him to do something as radical as he did. Anyway, so Christopher Knight quit the world at age 20, which is extraordinarily young for a hermit. Just imagine never getting another piece of advice from your elder after the age of 20. I mean, I'm 48 years old and I still call my father for advice frequently. He drove his car, Subaru Brat, into the woods of central Maine and abandoned it there, threw the keys in the center console, and at the age of 20, with very little supplies, just the most scant amount of camping gear, no maps, no compass, walked into the woods of central Maine and wasn't seen again for 27 years. It's an incredible story, and I do want to emphasize that everything I'm saying tonight is not only true, but it has been thoroughly vetted by fact checkers and lawyers and the police investigators and everything. This is a true story. No fake news going on here at the Art of Manliness.
So what year was this? 'Cause that's another important factor, because he probably missed a lot in 27 years.
Yeah, so Chris Knight departed the world, I believe it was 1986, and wasn't pulled out of the woods until 2013. So just imagine that in 1986, there had been, I think Reagan was president. There were no cell phones. Nobody had heard of the internet yet. It's not just even the years. It's like the years of his life. Between the ages of 20 and 47, most people, more or less live their entire life. Before that, you're sort of a young kid. And after that, you're sort of a middle-aged man. This is when most people go to school, pick their job, get married, have a family, make all these massive life changes, buy a house, figure things out. But this guy lived by himself for the basically the heart of his life.
So the next question is like, why? Like, what caused him to do it? I mean, was it a Unabomber thing where he's like fed up with society, wanted to get away from it? Did he have some sort of spiritual motive? Like, what caused him to drive his car in the middle of the woods and just give it up and then walk out into it?
I think that's the operative question, why? And of course, that was the first question on my mind. It was like, how did he survive, which we can get into, but why? Why would you quit the world for 27 years? And I'll try and be as brief as possible. And the answer is actually sort of simple, but the reason why it's very difficult to imagine is that most people, me, you, I'm sure the vast majority of people listening to this, don't really spend much time alone. And we really, as humans, we really don't like to spend that much time alone. It's clear. Like, watch anybody when they have like 12 idle seconds. What's the first thing most people do these days? They fish their cell phone out of their pocket and try to connect in some way or another. But Chris Knight, like, despite the fact that 99.9% of us don't like to be alone, there has been throughout human history, since the beginning of recorded time, which goes back about 5,000 years, in every culture, at all times, there's been a thin but distinct stream of people that really wanted to be alone. And there is even a genetic component to this. And Chris Knight expressed many of the same things that, the hermits throughout history have said, which is that he always felt a little uncomfortable around other people, more than a little uncomfortable. And he really liked his own company. And it was like, he described it as this sort of gravitational pull. When I was talking to Chris Knight, I was guessing, did you commit a crime? Were you embarrassed about something? Were you confused about, say, this is the 80s in central Maine. Were you confused about your sexuality, something? And he said, no, it was nothing specific like that. And really anything like that's not going to keep you away for 27 years. So Chris Knight had this radical idea of how he wanted to live his life, and he decided to attempt it. He decided to fulfill his most radical idea pretty much probably more fully than, I'll just speak for myself, more fully than I will ever dare, and probably most people listening will ever dare. And why did he leave the world? He left the world because he just didn't feel comfortable being around other people. He felt this tug to be alone. But the better question, Brett, is, why did he stay? And the answer to that question I find really fascinating. He stayed alone because he really liked it. He expressed a great deal of contentment. Now, he definitely suffered during winters and definitely suffered from hunger sometimes, but overall, he said he loved being alone. He expressed more contentment about his life than most people I meet out here in the world. And so he left because he felt this strong tug, but he stayed because he was happy. I mean, what are we all searching for in life? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. He found it.
Yeah. We'll get into how he's able to do this. I thought it was interesting when he finally got caught, there was all these therapists and analysts, like, trying to figure out, like, what was that component? He felt uncomfortable around people. Was he autistic, or did he have some sort of other thing? But like the consensus was, there was no consensus that something was, quote unquote, wrong with Chris Knight. Like, he just had a tendency, he wanted to be by himself, and he enjoyed it.
I mean, of course, I can't blame anyone for thinking like, oh, what's wrong with this guy? Because that's exactly what I thought. And Chris Knight was examined by a state psychologist who offered a couple of things, the obvious sort of like Asperger's or something on the autism spectrum. But I spoke with many, people who said they couldn't make a specific diagnosis without actually talking to Chris Knight himself, but really reviewed the case. And as you just said, there really is no diagnosable syndrome that you can pin on Chris Knight. Many autism experts said to me, we just could not consider him to be on the autism spectrum. He had to plan ahead. In the annals of autism, there's no examples of a person who survived by themselves for this long, who can plan ahead, who had all these, he just didn't fit any diagnosis at all. In fact, it'd be like saying, every hermit has a problem. In fact, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but the truth is, like, probably there's 2 or 3 days a week where I'm, driving my 3 kids around and they're fighting in the back seat, and I'm stuck in traffic, and there's terrible news coming out of the radio, and 6, text messages. My phone's binging constantly, and I'm late for not only my projects, but the meeting I'm supposed to be at. And I'm sort of stressed out, and I'm thinking that, it's not really Chris Knight who's crazy. It's the rest of us. And I really mean that.
Yeah. And like, he was kind of self-aware of that. Like, when you talk to him, he'd say, like, I know people think I'm crazy. I understand that, but like maybe you guys are the crazy ones. Like he was very philosophical about his solitude, even though he wouldn't say that he's being philosophical.
Right. So, just briefly to keep the story a little coherent, Chris Knight planned to spend his entire life in the woods. He never wanted to come out ever, not 27 years, not ever. He planned to die completely anonymously. But as I mentioned, he did steal food and other survival supplies and books and was eventually caught. And we can get into that. But, and so was forcibly removed from his solitude. And that's the only reason I was able to talk to him. He was actually in jail. And so most of the time we met was in the jail visiting room. And if there is one thing I can say about Chris Knight, and there's lots of things I can say about him, but he is extraordinarily intelligent. I rarely encountered someone who could not just quote from 1,000 books. He seemed to have a photographic memory, though he denied it. I don't have a photographic memory. I just remember everything, which seems to me like. And as you mentioned, he said he didn't leave the world to make any statement. He wasn't trying to make any of us feel bad about our decisions. He just did what he wanted to do. He did feel terrible about having to steal, and we can, that's a whole other issue, whether Chris Knight should be forgiven or not for his crimes, and nobody's wrong on that one. But he felt that he found the place where he was most content in the world. And if for other people it was, in the middle of a office building or, sitting in front of a computer most of the day or raising a family, then he never wanted anyone to feel bad about their own choices, but had this very sort of, sophisticated, intelligent, this sort of inscrutable air about him where he felt that his choices were completely logical for him.
And it wasn't like scary, because like a lot of times, hermits or people who kind of go out, like they kind of scare you because they go out there for like scary reasons. Like, as you said, he didn't judge others. He's like, I just wanted to do my thing and be left alone.
Yeah, unfortunately, and Chris Knight was aware of this, he did frighten other people. He broke into there are a couple of maybe 300 houses, second homes in the Lake region where Chris Knight, he camped in the same site, Chris Knight, for more than 25 of his 27 years. He basically spent a little more than a year wandering around the woods of central Maine, really not knowing exactly where he was, though sensing it, and then found this amazing spot in the woods, not too far from civilization, but certainly far enough so that he could be completely alone, and broke into he had about 100 cabins in his repertoire. And really, some people were extraordinarily disturbed by his actions, and he knew this and didn't feel great about it, but sort of made the decision that he would rather be alone and steal than in the world and law-abiding. And so it's a very complicated and sort of, he never quite, Chris Knight himself never quite resolved the conundrum about being a thief.
So let's talk about, how he survived for 27 years. So you've been talking about he's been stealing food. What was his camp like? And, because like, as you said, Maine winters are crazy cold. During the springtime, they have this terrible black fly season where they just swarm you and bite you. It's terrible. He never lit a fire. So was he able to build himself a place to live comfortably? I mean, relatively comfortably for 25 years.
Yeah. So, Chris Knight's story is literally unbelievable. Like, everybody I asked, I'd say about 80% of the residents of central Maine, the victims of his crime. And normally, the closer I get to a story, the more people explain it, the more believable it is. But this was almost the opposite. The closer I came to the area Chris lived, the less people could believe it. And a few of the things people said to me were like, how is it possible to go 27 years without lighting a fire? How is it possible to go 27 years without seeing a doctor? How is it possible to have a campsite not that far away that no one's ever been by? How did Chris Knight survive the great ice storm of 1998? And on and on and on. And I was able to ask Chris Knight all of these questions. And I was searching for like one, when someone tells you a story and you find one tiny thing that contradicts what they're saying, well, then the whole story falls apart like a house of cards. Like if I had gone to his site and found one charred piece of wood that indicated there was a fire, the whole thing would fall apart. And I'm going to tell you, after I spent 3 years working on this book, I never found a single thing that contradicted anything Chris Knight said. And even the police officers that arrested him exclaimed that they probably had rarely met someone who seemed so honest as Chris Knight. So just quickly, like, how do you go 27 years without getting sick or needing to see a doctor? Well, the way we get sick is by being around each other. We exchange bacteria, we exchange germs, we exchange viruses. If you're not around other people, you don't get sick. You can still get something like diabetes or cancer. But when I talked to doctors, they said it made perfect sense that Chris Knight never got sick. It's in terms of, say, the Great Ice Storm of 1998, as Chris Knight himself said, it was like 28 degrees during that Great Ice Storm. It really wasn't that cold. It was terrible for the electrical wires, and you couldn't drive a car 10 feet without skidding off the road, but it was perfectly fine for him. Not only that, he actually liked it to put a layer of ice over the snow, and he could walk around without leaving footprints. He wished it was a Great Ice Storm every week. Now, he told me to find his site, and a lot of the answers would be clear. And I spent most of my life in Montana. I've spent a lot of time camping and hiking in the woods. I consider myself a decent woodsman, but wow, I have never seen woods as thick, as dense, as difficult to navigate as Chris Knight's forest. Not only were there tons of trees tangled all over each other in a very thick undergrowth, the last ice age smothered Maine in glaciers. And when the glaciers retreated, they left behind these enormous automobile-sized boulders, which are just everywhere in Chris Knight's woods. The woods are so thick, not even that many deer walk through. It's just impossible to navigate. Chris Knight learned to walk in these woods almost silently. He memorized all these patterns where he could step on a root and on a rock. He could not snap a branch. He could not even leave a footprint. And it took me a long time to find this site, even though I knew approximately where it was and that it was very close, within, if you knew exactly where you're going, 3 minutes to the nearest mud driveway. And it was one of the most, I'm still imagining right now as I'm talking to you, the first time I found a site. It was like the entrance was between these two boulders that when you looked at it, most directions, it looked like it was one big rock. I called it the elephant rock, but from a certain angle, you could see that there was a big crack in the rock where I guess it had split during the glacial period. And you could sort of twist your body and sneak between these two rocks. And I did that. And there was a site, and it was like one of the most gorgeous things I've ever seen. And I told you I've spent a lot of times in the woods. It's like Chris Knight had cleared out like a cube of forest. Imagine the forest as dense as a Brillo pad all around you, and suddenly you walk into this clearing. But it even had a roof overhead because the tree branches linked. And, Chris Knight was aware of this. And a couple of police officers said they did a few flyovers looking for this dude's camp, and never found it. And it was understandable why, because there was a roof overhead. It was completely cleared out. His floor was perfectly flat. And what Chris Knight had done for years and years and years, he stole and read a lot of magazines and books. And very often when he was finished with them, he would make what he called bricks. He would tie stacks of them together, tape them with electrical tape, which he stole, the electrical tape, and bury them in his site and make a perfectly flat floor that also was excellent for draining rainwater. And so he had this perfectly flat floor, this beautifully cleared out space, an impossible to find spot in a dense woods. And I spent 5 nights there across all seasons. And even to this moment right now, talking to you, when I feel stressed out, when I feel like the world is getting a little too loud and crazy, I think about that spot. I never went there with anybody else. I spent that time alone, and it was amazing. You could hear the forest. You could see not too far into the forest because it was so dense, but you really felt like you were in this, I don't know, have you ever been to like one of those aquariums where there's like a tube where you can walk through and you're like underwater? Like it felt like I was like in a room in the forest with but yet able to breathe and have my own little space. I don't think I could really overstate how fantastically lovely this spot was, and I understood why he wanted to stay there. I don't know if I want to stay there 25 years, but boy, I could use a couple of long weekends there now and again.
Right. So as I said earlier, this book, you use it to explore the idea of solitude and hermitage. Let's talk about, as you mentioned earlier, since the beginning of recorded history, there have been hermits. Can you kind of give us the rough thumbnail sketch of the history of hermitage in humanity?
Yeah, some of the very first writings we have that exist, some writings etched on animal bones from ancient China, and some writings scratched onto clay tablets from Mesopotamia mention wild men or shamans, people living alone in the wilderness. And so, as I said, certainly before recorded history and for all of recorded history, there have been people that wanted to be by themselves. The majority of these people did it for religious reasons, to seek a closer relationship with God. There's the famous desert fathers of early Christianity. Many Buddhists, of course, go on long retreats. Now, Chris Knight did not follow a formal religion and did not escape for any religious reasons. But the religion is the main reason. A secondary reason is sort of what I call protester hermits. A lot of people left the world because of war, because of pollution. Even right now in Japan, there are approximately 1 million young kids, most of them male, called hikikomori, which means pulling away, people that live in their rooms, often for more than a decade. And, this is sort of there's more than 1 million of them. It's sort of a epidemic in Japan. There's even like therapists that offer counseling through the internet, but people that sort of just quit the pressure cooker society, that's especially prevalent in Japan. And so these are like people that are protesting. And then the last type of hermit is someone like a Henry David Thoreau, someone who leaves for maybe artistic or self-fulfillment reasons. There's been also some sort of tangential hermits. In the early 1800s. There was a fad in England among the aristocracy. If you had a large estate, it was a fad to hire a hermit. They were called ornamental hermits. And there's these people put advertisements in newspapers offering to pay. It was like $7 a month for a person who was willing to grow a long beard and live in a cave on a estate in the British countryside. And, these aristocrats felt that hermits sort of had the air of wisdom and maybe, I don't know, mystery or something. And it became this very amusing fad that lasted 30 or so years.
Yeah. And are there hermits still today I'm sure there are hermits still today. You just mentioned the people in Japan, but like, I think you mentioned there's like internet forums dedicated to being a hermit, which seems sort of counterintuitive.
Yeah, actually
paradoxical.
I have hermit-ish tendencies. I am certainly by no means a hermit, but my job writing involves spending a lot of time by myself, and sometimes I even find it enjoyable. And I was a long distance runner and things like that. So while I am by no means a hermit, I sort of get the need to be apart from people. I do need my alone time. There are hermits today. Now, I want to say one more thing, which sometimes I'm almost like, I don't know if shy is the right word. Like sometimes there's things that are so extraordinary that you just don't even bother to say it because people don't believe it. But I'm just going to say one more thing. I lost my mind researching hermits. Now, I will not brag about too many things on this world, but I will tell you might never speak to anyone who knows more about hermits than I do. I read more than 100 books about hermits. I read thousands of articles about hermits. I read everything there was to know. I just wanted to compare Chris Knight's experiences with other hermits. And I'm going to tell you, I never found a single example of another person who went 27 years without at least somebody checking up on them, bringing them food, just asking if they were okay. Never did I find a single example. I will say that with pretty fair authority that Chris Knight, right here with 7 billion or so people on planet Earth in the age of, Facebook and Twitter, I think Chris Knight might be the most solitary known human who ever lived.
That's crazy. What's interesting, you talk about how even like the hermits, like they sort of debated whether Chris Knight was a true hermit. I mean, what was going on there? Because he didn't see anybody except for a lone hiker.
There's a little hermit community, which sounds like an oxymoron, but yes, there's a wonderful website called hermitary.com. Check it out. I read every single article on it. It's if you're at all interested in hermits, this is a great storehouse. And they actually have I guess you could call it a chat room. Now you have to prove that you're a hermit, and I did not qualify to join the chat room, but I was privy to some of the things that people write. And mostly, it's not like they're chatting with each other. You just sort of post a message and log off. Usually there was only 1 or 2 people on the site at a time. And even Chris Knight said to me that the internet sounded interesting to him because you could send a message to someone without actually talking to them via telephone or meeting them in person. So in a very strange way, if you are a very shy person or have hermit tendencies, email is a great way to communicate with someone because there is no face-to-face, there is no back and forth, there's no conversation at all. It sort of makes sense if you think about it. But this community really debated whether you could consider Chris Knight to be a hermit because he stole, and that goes against the ideal of hermits. Now, there are no official rule books for hermits, by the way, so it's not like it's not baseball here. It's not like we could do the replay and decide whether he's hermit or not a hermit. But they thought that anyone who invaded other people's privacy or their lives didn't deserve the lofty label of hermit. And Chris Knight himself said he didn't care whether he was a hermit or not. He didn't put a label at all on what he did, and putting a label on anything is a really worthless exercise. And, I sometimes love talking with Chris Knight because he always made me feel that even writing an entire book about him was sort of just an egotistical trip on my part. And I would sometimes, he's like, oh, you're going to take your thoughts and package them in a commodity and ask people to spend money to read it. Well, very, very good for you.
Well, you mentioned Thoreau. He's kind of held as America's prototypical hermit. But Knight, when you brought up Thoreau with Chris, like Chris said, no, he's a dilettante. He's a phony. Why did Knight have so much disdain for Thoreau?
Oh man, I think that Walden is one of the most I reread Walden doing this research for this book, and maybe I was too young when I read it the first time, because I was like, all right, I'll give Walden a shot. It's a very difficult thing, but boy, I really found it to be beautifully written, and I'm a fan of Thoreau. Now, so I was like, of course, Walden Pond was in Massachusetts, not that far from, New England, crotchety people, guys going off by themselves. I'm like, of course, I'm going to, compare you to Thoreau. I meant it as a compliment. Chris Knight had such humorously negative reaction to Thoreau. Now, let me just tell you a couple of things about Henry David Thoreau. First of all, Thoreau spent only 2 years in his cabin in Walden Pond. He walked into the town of Concord frequently. His mother did his laundry. He once had a dinner party that had 20 guests. And the worst thing Thoreau did, of course, was write Walden. And the reason why Chris Knight felt that Thoreau did not deserve to be a hermit is because when you write a book, you're basically telling everyone in the world, like, look at me, here I am, this is what I think. Chris Knight didn't care about anybody else. His back was totally turned to the world. The thought of, he didn't even write one sentence down his entire time in the woods, didn't take one photo, didn't draw any pictures. These were all for other people to see. Chris Knight just really wasn't interested in anybody else. And he thought that anybody who went off by themselves to write a poem or, paint a picture or do an opera was really just spending time alone so that they could show off for the rest of the world. And Chris had no interest in that.
Yeah. And as I was reading your book, reading about the history of hermits and being alone, and even Chris Knight's, I thought it was interesting that being a hermit, both conceptually and practically, requires other people. Right? Like, as you said, these hermits in the past, they have people bring them food, make pilgrims, check on them. But even Chris, even though he didn't see people, he still depended on people in their cabins to provide food for him. So it's like pretty much like this idea of like the self-contained, self-reliant person. Like, it's kind of a myth. Like, we need other people.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no shortage of contradictions in this tale. Even Chris Knight would nod and say that there are. Chris Knight, of course, he relied on other people. He stole everything he needed to survive. In fact, when he was arrested after 27 years, the only thing in the world he had that he could say was his, that he didn't steal, were his eyeglasses. And in fact, the arresting officers were also disbelieving of his story. They found a high school photo of Chris Knight. He actually went to school in central Maine, not too far away from where he was arrested. And the high school yearbook was brought to them. And lo and behold, there was Chris Knight in the high school yearbook at the age of 18, wearing the same set of glasses that he was arrested in at age 47. And when they saw that they were the same pair of glasses, both arresting officers said to me that there was something in their head that clicked, that this guy was telling the truth. It would have been really, really complicated for a shy person not seeking publicity to make this all up. It just didn't make sense that he would make this up. And the pair of glasses really was the moment when people realized that Chris Knight was telling the truth.
Did Chris ever describe to you like what it felt like being alone all those years?
He did, yeah. Why, how, and then what did it feel like? And I have to tell you, again, this is one of those topics that just sort of defies imagination. Chris Knight, he read a lot. He even played a couple of old handheld video games that he stole. He had a handheld video game policy. He only stole them that were at least 2 generations old. He didn't want to deprive any children of their Christmas presents, he said. And besides, in a couple of years, he'd be stealing them anyway. But he listened to the radio a little bit. But for the most part, what Chris Knight did, what do you do for 27 years old by yourself? For the most part, what Chris Knight did was what you and I would term nothing. He just sat there. But Chris Knight told me that he was never for an instant bored. In fact, he said that he didn't really even understand the concept of boredom. And then what's even more impressive, and I don't think I could capture the poetry of Chris Knight as well as he spoke very beautifully, and I tried to capture it in the book, but I will paraphrase. He said to me that he didn't actually even feel alone. In fact, he told me, and this sentiment was repeated in various forms in dozens upon dozens of books written by hermits, religious and non-religious alike. He said that rather than feeling alone, he felt absolutely and entirely connected to like the rest of the universe, the world. He said that, there was not even a a mirror in his camp. So he didn't even know what he looked like. He said that after a very short period of time alone, he wasn't entirely aware of where he ended and the forest began. He said he just felt intimately connected with everything and never lonely. It's the way he described it was, in fact, frankly, it gave me it sort of gave me chills. It's like, I feel like people in this outside world, as opposed to Chris Knight's world, where we have a billion video games and a million books and a lot of things to occupy our mind. People often express that they're bored or have nothing to do. And Chris Knight, without any of these distractions, never felt that for a second.
So why is it that Chris Knight and these other hermits can feel that, and then we use solitude as punishment in our prisons? And that, there's research that says that people basically go crazy when they're alone like that. So what's the difference? What's going on there?
Right. As you mentioned, the harshest punishment in the United States penal system, besides the death penalty, is solitary confinement. And in fact, Amnesty International has declared that, spending more than 2 weeks in solitary confinement is considered torture. A huge percentage of prisoners that are in solitary confinement lose their mind and go crazy. Solitude is a very interesting state. Some people seek it and love it. Most people avoid it at all costs and absolutely hate it. It is one of the reasons why it is fascinating. And so when I talk about people finding solace and people finding joy, I'm talking about voluntary solitude. Involuntary solitude is practically torture. And it's one of the reasons why the subject is extremely fascinating. Most of us just hate it. There was a study conducted by the University of Virginia a couple of years ago in which they showed that about 60% of men and 35% of women would rather give themselves electric shocks than sit quietly with nothing to do for 15 minutes. We really don't like to be alone with ourselves. Humans were one of the reasons most anthropologists consider humans to be the dominant species on the planet isn't because we're the fastest animal or the strongest animal, but because we have really big brains. But more importantly, we're able to link them up and work together. We're sort of programmed to work together. Even in Genesis in the Bible, it said, God did not want Adam to be alone. It was like one of the first things that God did was like, he can't be alone. It goes to be alone voluntarily for most of us seems to go against everything we've ever felt or heard. But there are, like I said, those that love it, speak so highly of it and talk about such rich experiences. This is voluntary aloneness. There have been like 20 studies done around the world that sort of examine the effects of solitude and quiet on humans. And every study has come up with the exact same conclusions, which is that time alone, time in nature, time by yourself makes you calmer. It makes you healthier. There's all the stress hormones are reduced. It makes you smarter. There are tests of memory and reading retention, and it makes you happier. There's really time alone, voluntary time alone is great for you. Humans are our species is about 2 million years old. And for 99% of the time that we've been humans, we all lived in small groups of hunter-gatherers and spent a lot of time alone or in tiny groups in quiet situations, and every single one of our senses is calibrated to that. Technology, changes very quickly. Evolution is very slow. Take a hike in the woods. All of us feel good about it. Why? Because that's what all of our senses are calibrated to: being quiet in the woods, not playing Nintendo.
Right. So 27 years, Knight was alone. How did he eventually get caught? What changed?
So as I mentioned, there was this sort of legend that built up. There's several hundred houses around these lakes, and everybody was missing. People are missing stakes, their Stephen King novel, their flashlights, their batteries, their sleeping bag, but there were no smashed windows, there was no kicked in doors. Your TV's there, your computer's there, your jewelry's there. People were very confused, but there was definitely something going on. When people examined their cabins very closely, they saw that sometimes the hasp on their window, the lock on their window was open, and there were file marks and even some file shavings. So someone had been inside, and the police had been called, and they couldn't find it, and nobody knew. Was it a neighbor? Was it some Vietnam vet that was disgruntled? Was it a gang initiation? Was it two brothers that both owned cabins on a pond thought the other was the one who was stealing? Nobody knew, And this went on for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years and became this legend. And the people around the lake gave the legend a name. They called it the North Pond Hermit, but they really didn't know if there was a hermit. In fact, most people assumed no way would a guy be out there for that long. It was probably some neighbor, some gang initiation, some prank, something. Anyway, finally, after more than a quarter century and intermittent police searches, I mean, really, it just sort of fell between the cracks. Like, there's a lot of problems in central Maine, and somebody stealing hamburger meat and batteries just never made it to like the number one problem for the police department. But a game warden named Terry Hughes, who lived in the area where this legend took place, realized that this was not the Loch Ness Monster or the Himalayan Yeti. There was something happening, and damn it, he was going to solve it. And Terry Hughes is a great guy, but when he puts his mind to something, he sort of puts his mind to it. And like he contacted Homeland Security, and I won't get into all the details, but he put like electric eyes around in the forest, and he had silent alarms that would ring his cell phone in the middle of the night. And finally, after 27 years, Terry Knight caught the North Pond Hermit red-handed stealing some hamburger meat and cheese from a local summer camp that was closed for the season, and the 27-year reign the hermit came to an end.
And what was that like for Knight to have his reign in the woods ended?
Well, Knight was an extremely cautious thief, but he knew that every time he left his camp in the woods, and even in his camp in the woods, which by the way was on private property, a 200-acre lot, he knew that his time in the woods could come to an end at any moment. And he sort of sensed it. Over the 27 years, he saw technology improve. First there was no security system, then there was these very large clunky cameras, and then they got so small that they could hide inside of smoke detectors. And he knew that technology was getting better, locks were getting better, and that he hoped to stay out there all his life. But while he was certainly startled and shocked, there was always a piece of his mind. As I mentioned, he was a very bright person. There was no part of him that thought, this is a sure thing that I could live out here forever. He was, let's just say he was stoic. He was certainly not happy, but realized that this was a possibility. Terry Hughes, the straight-up law and order man who spent a decade in the Marines before he spent 18 years as a forest game warden, had a very, very interesting reaction. The man who really did most of the arrest was another officer named Diane Vance, who was also involved, but Terry Hughes did most of the heavy lifting. He had a very interesting reaction to Chris Knight. Terry Hughes is a extraordinarily able woodsman, has found many lost hikers, children that were lost in the woods, has just a sixth sense of able to read the woods so well, looking for any snapped branches or even a trace of a partial footprint, can notice these things, and never was able to find Chris Knight. The night of his arrest, he asked Chris Knight to show him his camp in the woods, and Chris Knight led him to it. And Terry Hughes followed Chris Knight step for step, and is the only known person ever to have witnessed Chris Knight walk in the woods. And he watched Chris Knight walk absolutely silently through this crazily dense forest, stepping on roots that he had stepped on for 20 years, moving, bending, twisting, striding, then didn't need a flashlight, didn't break a branch, had memorized the patterns of branches on hundreds of trees, knew how to duck and weave, and brought him to his magical site between the Elephant Rocks. And Terry Hughes said to me, it was possibly the most extraordinary event he had ever witnessed in his life. He thought he was a great woodsman, and then he basically met the king woodsman of all the world, and told me that here he is, a law and order guy that just arrested someone who confessed to breaking into homes 1,000 times. That's 1,000 felonies, and he actually felt a little bit bad for arresting the hermit.
And I mean, what's Chris Knight doing now?
So what do you do with a guy like Chris Knight? See, I think one of the things that also interested me about this story is that Chris Knight is not clearly completely crazy, and if someone is crazy, we have mental hospitals for them. And Chris Knight is clearly not a violent and evil criminal, and if you are that way, then we have jails for you. What do you do with a person who's not a criminal and not clearly mentally insane, but just doesn't fit into the world? What do we do? What do we do with that person? And the answer is we don't have any spot for that person. We don't know what to do with them. What do you do with Chris Knight? There was a huge debate. Without getting into too many details, he ended up spending 7 months in the county jail. Now, even one break-in, as I mentioned, one unauthorized break-in can get you 10 years in the state penitentiary. He confessed to 1,000 of them. So it was possible that he could have spent his entire life locked up in a cell. But even the district attorney realized that someone who had just spent 27 years completely free in the woods, being locked in a cage with another person, whether or not he deserved it, was not a just thing. And he spent 7 months and was given an extremely harsh probation that if he broke it, he would spend 7 years in jail. And Chris Knight observed his probation to the very letter and never made a tiny misstep. Where is he now? Well, Chris Knight gave me the most valuable thing he owns in all the world, which was his story. And he asked for nothing in return. He did not want me to pay him. He told his story because he realized that he would be hounded by journalists probably all his life. I was one of 500 journalists that requested an interview. And as far as I know, he only spoke to me. I'm very, very fortunate. And I will remain grateful to Chris Knight for sharing a story with me for all my life. Thank you, Chris. He told me a story. He realized that he would be hounded all his life. And if he told me his story, that he could sort of use it as a rampart, as a wall, as a defense. Like if you want to read about Chris Knight, take a look at the book, but please leave him alone. He told me a story and then he said, please, Mike, we're not friends. There was no phony journalist subject friendship going on here. He is a real, true hermit, Chris Knight. He said when he was done, he said, I really don't want to see you again. I'm done talking to you. And while I would love to receive a letter or a call from Chris Knight one day, I have left him completely alone. We're not in contact. So I'm not exactly sure where he is, but to the best of my knowledge, he's still living in central Maine. He's truly a survivor, has carved out a very quiet life for himself, and has, as far as I know, is not being disturbed by the outside world.
So writing this story and interacting with Chris all these years, what did you learn about solitude? And did you find yourself looking for more of it in your life after interacting with Chris?
Yeah, I sort of touched on this during our conversation about how our senses are calibrated to the woods and how it seems like we avoid being by ourselves at all costs. I mean, literally to the point that we have an extra 90 seconds, we will fish out our phone and send a text message or view our Twitter feed. We feel this crazy need to be in constant connection. I have a weird idea, and it's possibly the simplest suggestion that anyone could ever make. I bet you I'm not alone here in thinking that the tone, the tempo, the discourse, the public, what's going on in society right now seems a little bit crazy. I think we are tearing ourselves apart. I think that it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum. I think that we are really, really feeling like anger comes before any sort of understanding or compromise. I think we're all going crazy, to be honest with you. I have an idea. This is something that I have been doing. It would be wonderful if every single person who is listening to this spends, I'm not saying 27 years alone, I'm saying 10 minutes. The next time you have nothing to do nothing. Don't pull out your phone. Don't call anyone. Don't check your email. Don't do anything. Just be there quietly. I don't care if you're in the middle of a city street or in your bedroom or in a city park. Don't do anything for just a couple of minutes. Try it. How can that be a hard thing to do? I'm just asking people to do nothing. I'm not asking you to go and take some crazy meditation class or, lift weights every morning for 2 hours or take yoga. Just do nothing. I think if everybody in the entire world did nothing for 10 or 15 minutes a day, the temperature of the society, this craziness that's going on, would be decreased by an essential margin. We might all actually get along a little better. It's just my idea.
I like that. Do nothing. Well, Michael, this has been a great conversation. Where can people go learn more about the book? And I promise, after you guys read this book, you're going to kind of want to go out in the Maine woods by yourself, literally.
Yeah, just take a long weekend and maybe take this book along. It's called The Stranger in the Woods.
Yeah, take a long weekend.
I have a website. I go by Michael Finkel, very funny rhyming name. So www.michaelfinkel.com. If you're inspired to, there's a contact tab. Send me a note. It takes me sometimes a little while to get back in touch, but I answer everybody. Even if you want to say something negative, positive questions, feel free to get me on my website, michaelfinkel.com.
Michael Finkel, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me on. It really is a fun and rich topic to discuss, and I appreciate it.
My guest today was Michael Finkel. He's the author of the book, The Stranger in the Woods, The Extraordinary Story of the Last True Hermit. Find that book on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. You can also find out more information about Michael's work at michaelfinkel.com. Also, check out our show notes at aom.is/hermit. You can find links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic.